To please speak into the mic. I think the audience was having a little bit of trouble hearing earlier. So, good morning. My name is Luz Molina. I would like to call this meeting of the California Board of Accountancy's Legislative Committee meeting to order. Let's start by taking roll. Ms. Carola, would you like to begin?
Carola Nicholson.
Carrie Ann Farrell Hines.
Nancy Corrigan. Mary Gion.
Alicia Burhow.
Luz Molina Lopez.
Deirdre Robinson.
Okay, and with that, we have a quorum. Great. So to begin, our first agenda item is approval of the minutes. We do have the minutes from July 26, 2018, from the Legislative Committee. May I ask for a motion for the approval of the minutes?
So moved.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you. Are there any additional comments or discussions regarding the committee meetings, the committee minutes from July? Or any public comments? Seeing none, I will call for a vote. Ms. Reed, please begin.
Alicia Burhow,
Abstain.
Nancy Corrigan,
Abstain.
Carrie Ann Farrell Hines,
Abstain.
Mary Gion,
Abstain.
Luz Molina Lopez,
Yes.
Carola Nicholson,
Yes.
and Deirdre Robinson.
Abstain.
So passes.
Okay, sweet.
Okay. Okay, so let's see. Agenda item number 2 is an overview of the California legislative and regulatory process and the legislative committee's role. Mr. Bone?
Good morning and Happy New Year, members. This item is an overview of the California legislative and regulatory processes and the legislative committee's role in them. One of the main roles of this committee is to review, recommend, and promote legislation related to consumer protection and the practice of public accountancy. Provided in the agenda item is information regarding those processes and procedures that staff follow to ensure the effective monitoring of legislation, including the steps involved for regulatory changes. The common theme throughout these processes is communication. Staff routinely communicate with the legislature, other DCA entities, and DCA staff, stakeholders, and keep the CBA members informed of our activities. Pardon me. There are 3 attachments to this item for your reference. Attachment 1 contains an overview of the legislative process and the steps for a bill to become a law. If you turn to pages 4 and 5, you'll see a legislative calendar which has key dates that the legislature follows. You will notice that February 22nd is the last day for bills to be introduced. In the days leading up to that date, nearly 2,000 bills are expected to be introduced. Therefore, the March Legislative Committee meeting is typically quite full as staff prepare to review those analyses and determine which bills are relevant to the CBA, and prepare analyses for your consideration. Attachment 2 contains considerations for taking positions on legislation and is a good tool to reference when this committee and the CBA takes positions on bills. This information is also provided in the binder for each meeting. Attachment 3 contains an overview of the regulatory process, which explains the steps involved in amending regulations and ensuring public participation. Page 6 of the attachment includes a graphic that describes those essential steps. I know this was a very brief overview, Madam Chair, and there's a lot of information here, so I'll be happy to answer any questions you and the members may have.
Thank you. I did have one question. Is this rulemaking process across all boards or just specific to CBA?
No, that is a description of the Administrative Procedures Act, and those rules are applicable to broadly any state body that would be pursuing a rulemaking.
Got it. Thank you. Are there any comments from the members? Any public comment? Okay, seeing none, let's move on to agenda item number 3. Update on legislative proposal for inclusion in the 2019 annual omnibus bill, Business and Professions Code Section 5100.1, determining discipline, certified, or true and correct copies of action. Mr. Bone, please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This item is an update on the Senate Business, Professions, and Economic Development Committee's 2019 Omnibus Bill. An omnibus bill is legislation that is authored by that committee and is intended to help DCA boards and bureaus make non-controversial or non-substantive amendments to state law. As noted in the materials for this agenda item, in November of 2017, the CBA approved a change in statute to require the CBA to rely upon certified or true and correct copies of disciplinary or other action as conclusive evidence for the purposes of determining discipline. That change was made effective by adding BPC 5100.1, which took effect January 1 of this year. CBA staff submitted the language that you see before you in the attachment to the legislature, which would replace the term subsections with subdivisions to refer to the specific causes for discipline that are discussed in BPC 5100 subdivisions D, H, and L. This proposal does not affect how this code section operates. Rather, it would simply update it with the appropriate term, again, replacing subsection with subdivision. There's no action required on this item, Madam Chair, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Any comments from the committee members? No public comments? Okay, let's move on to item number 4, an update on the California Board of Accountancy's sunset review. Again, Mr. Bone, please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since the November 2018 CBA meeting, the staff have been very busy working with the governor's administration and the legislature to help ensure a smooth and successful sunset review. Over the past few weeks, staff have met multiple times with staff of the Assembly and the Senate Business and Professions Committee to discuss our report and answer questions that may surround our requested statutory amendments. In a meeting held last week, CBA staff had a positive and productive conversation related to the language that the CBA included in our report to address the CBA's concerns with the implementation of AB 2138. That bill passed last year and affects the CBA's authority to consider certain types of criminal and unprofessional conduct when evaluating an application for licensure. We are grateful for the open and collaborative approach that we've been able to take with the legislature and so far, and look forward to continuing a positive dialogue on our sunset report, particularly as it relates to AB 2138, and we look forward to having a resolution on those topics in the coming weeks. Later this month, we expect to receive from legislative staff certain questions regarding our report that may seek clarification or ask for additional information surrounding the CBA's operations. Our answers to those questions will help form a background paper that will be provided to the CBA by the middle of February. That background paper will help inform the members of the legislature during our sunset hearing, which has been scheduled for Tuesday, February 26th. During the sunset hearing, legislators will hear testimony from the CBA and ask questions on topics that are identified ahead of time. This hearing is only an informational gathering session and no votes are expected during that hearing. Following that, in March or April of this year, we expect a hearing in the Assembly Business and Professions Committee on the bill that will, we expect, contain a sunset extension and other statutory changes requested by the CBA or the legislature. That concludes my remarks, Madam Chair. I'm happy to answer any questions.
I did have one question. What is the expectation for the sunset extension? How many years? Is it years or?
It's typically 4 years. 4 years at a time is the typical cycle. So that's our expectation.
Okay. Any questions from committee members? Any questions from the public? Seeing none, let's proceed with agenda item 5, review and possible consideration of positions on legislation the California Board of Accountancy is monitoring. Mr. Bone, would you like to proceed?
I would, Madam Chair. Thank you. The legislature returned to session last month, and bills are being introduced now for consideration in the 2019-2020 legislative session. In the materials for this agenda item, staff noted several spot bills, along with bills related to the regulation of the cannabis industry, as the CBA has directed staff to track these types of bills. In addition, in your hand carry items are analyses for 2 bills, item 5G, which is Senate Bill 51, and item 5H, which is Senate Bill 53. Madam Chair, unless the committee has questions or comments about items 5A through F, with your permission, I suggest moving to item G, Senate Bill 51, followed by item H.
Okay. Are there any questions from committee members? Seeing none, we can proceed.
Thank you. Senate Bill 51 would create cannabis limited charter banks and cannabis limited charter credit unions to provide certain financial services to businesses engaged in the cannabis industry. Due to current federal law, businesses engaged in this industry are unable typically to engage with federally insured financial institutions. Instead, these businesses tend to operate on a cash business, which, according to the author, presents numerous public safety and tax reporting and accounting challenges. This bill is nearly identical to Senate Bill 930, which was introduced and discussed by the CBA last year, was introduced by the same author, Senator Bob Hertzberg. The CBA took a watch position on that bill last year, but it failed to pass the legislature. I've been in contact with the author's office, and they appreciate the CBA's consideration of this bill. Further, if the CBA declines, they informed me, if the CBA declines to adopt a position other than support, they express a desire to meet and discuss potential amendments that may resolve any concerns the CBA may have. In light of the CBA's position on the prior bill, Madam Chair, staff recommend a watch position on Senate Bill 51. And at this time, I'll turn it back to you for any questions.
Okay, thank you. Any questions on this one? Ms. Nicholson?
Do we know why it failed, the previous bill failed?
It's not clear. It failed in the Assembly Appropriations Committee on what's called their suspense file. Bills go to the suspense file when they have a cost associated with them. And I believe in looking at the appropriations analysis last year, they noted a $2 million cost to the Department of Business Oversight, which would be the entity that would be standing up the structures and regulatory process for these new financial institutions.
Ms.
Thank you.
Burha?
Has the governor's office weighed in on this yet?
Not to my knowledge.
Ms. Jiang?
Do you know if these limited cannabis bank or credit union, is it gonna, do you know if they just do that business only, or does it do other banking?
My understanding, based upon the bill, Ms. Zhang, is that they are limited they are very limited in their scope and meant to provide modest financial services, deposits, and certain check writing authority. But checks can only be used in certain fashions, like to pay state taxes or local government fees, to pay rent associated with your businesses. But it's somewhat walled off from the rest of the larger financial institutions in our country.
Ms. Burha?
Will these banks or these credit unions be affiliated with any of our well-known banks and credit unions throughout the state? Or are these going to be separate entities or state banks, per se?
I believe these are state institutions, as these would be stood up and administered by this California Department of Business Oversight. And my understanding, based upon watching testimony from last year, that was necessary and also intentional because of current federal law. The intersection between these new institutions and the federally insured institutions is problematic.
And then just real quick, sorry, did any of the financial institutions, again, our standard ones, did they weigh in on this bill at all last year?
I don't have that information. I apologize.
Ms. Robinson?
My question is regarding the FDIC, since they're not involved and they provide a level of insurance that provides protection to consumers, can you tell me what level of insurance these state banks will be providing?
Not in specific. I believe much of those types of decisions will be left to the Department of Business Oversight, as they would be creating regulations and the other structures necessary. I believe the bill does speak to the authority to go out and secure private insurance.
Okay,
But I confess that goes a bit beyond my expertise.
understood. Mine as well.
All of us.
Thank you for your patience.
Any more comments?
No, one more.
Yes, Ms. Jiang?
So I assume, how they're gonna set these up? I mean, they're gonna be statewide in major metropolitan area, in the rural area? Do you have any ideas?
Again, I believe those would be decisions that would largely be left to the Department of Business Oversight.
Great. Thank you for that discussion. Do we take public comments on this? No? We can. Are there any comments from the public? Okay. If not, we can move on to item H. Oh, do we need to
we
make a
do
motion on
vote?
this? Yes, okay, so Thank you. So the staff recommendation is to take a watch position on this Senate Bill 51, financial institutions regarding cannabis. May I have a motion?
So moved.
Thank you. May I have a second? Thank you. Again, any more opportunity for discussion or comments? Okay, I will call for the vote.
Deirdre Robinson,
Yes.
Corolla Nicholson, Yes. Luz Molina Lopez,
Yes.
Mary Jiang,
Yes,
Carrie Ann Farrell Hines.
Yes.
Nancy Corrigan,
Yes.
and Alicia Burhow.
Yes.
Great, with that, the motion carries. Now we can proceed with the next one.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is Senate Bill 53. This bill would amend the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act to require meetings of two-member advisory committees to comply with the various requirements of the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act, which include, among other things, providing a 10-day notice and publishing an agenda, opening that meeting to the public, recording the meeting, and publishing minutes. Senate Bill 53 is a reintroduction of Assembly Bill 85 from the year 2015. It's also very similar to AB 2058 from the year 2014. Both of those bills passed the legislature unanimously, but were both vetoed by Governor Brown. The CBA adopted an opposed position on both of those bills. Currently, the CBA and its committees use two-member committees or advisory bodies to conduct research and investigate various items and report back to the CBA or the committee for consideration and debate and decision in a public meeting. Advisory committees may not take independent action. For example, as noted in the analysis, the CBA's Peer Review Oversight Committee, or PROC, uses a two-member advisory committee to conduct oversight of the peer review program through site visits and meetings with representatives of CalCPA. Under Senate Bill 53, such a visit would be limited to one PROC member. Otherwise, it would be subject to the requirements of the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act. In addition, staff believes Senate Bill 53 could limit the CBA's communication and outreach programs. If those activities included more than one CBA member, that meeting may be subject to the requirements of the Bagley-Keene Act. Over the past several days, I have engaged in phone and email conversations with the author's office. They note that local government bodies are already subject to this requirement, and they believe it is appropriate to extend the same requirement to state bodies. In addition, the author's office believes that state bodies may be conducting business in closed meetings that should be held open in public session. I relayed some of our concerns that the CBA expressed in our veto letter from AB 85, which is attached to this item. And the author's office indicated that it is not their intention to limit or inhibit our outreach or communication functions. Madam Chair, based upon our position on the prior legislation and the bill's impacts to the CBA's operations, staff do recommend an opposed position on this bill, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Should we get the motion first or discussion? Okay, can I get a motion to adopt staff's recommendation to oppose this Senate Bill 53 for open meetings?
Move to oppose.
Thank you.
second.
Thank you. Okay, any questions or comments at this time? Ms. Farrell Hines?
I just wanted to know, did the author's staff raise any of the circumstances under which some of the concerns that they had arose? And separately, what was their response to the statement that the committees don't make rules, themselves, not decision-making bodies?
So I'll answer your last question first. So there was no particular response to that question about independent action. I don't think that's necessarily an item that they did not express any, they did not rebut that, that statement, I suppose, is the best way to respond to that. And could you repeat your first question again? I apologize.
It was about, did they talk about what sort of initiated this, because
I
this
see,
was
thank you.
several years ago now that,
Yeah.
they introduced it. So was there something that sort of, spurred them to come back to this issue?
And that's my question, because it's, what abuse did they cite? I'm curious, what specific abuse did they cite that's spurring this?
So, two things. One is the parity between, not an abuse so much, than the parity between local government bodies and state bodies. But they did cite to me over the phone one specific example of a state body, not the CBA, but that they believe is functioning and making some decisions in closed meetings, which should be conducted in the public.
Ms. Burhouse?
So basically, one body out of, and we've got 370, state boards of account, or just state boards, bureaus, so one agency, and they're basically saying that everyone needs to comply with one example of abuse, is that right?
Well, they didn't put it quite like that. But they did provide, I'm not,
Thank you, yes.
I don't mean to be glib, but they did provide one example.
Okay.
But you are correct, their solution would broadly apply to every state body.
Well,
But it's not a widespread issue, this is just one, okay.
I don't, they've not presented, at least at this point in our discussions, they've not presented a widespread problem.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Farrell Hines?
and it's, just Ms. Hines is
Ms.
fine.
Hines.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to make sure that if in this continuing to make this, to move this bill along, that they are aware, that the authors and his staff are aware that, that there should be some connection to the costs and the work that would be, required with, complying with this law, and what's the relationship to the abuse and the problem that has been identified. Because if we're talking about, situations that don't normally occur, or, really occur in limited circumstances, it seems really a disproportionate response to the problem that the bill's author is citing. And that becomes, I think, especially notable given the amount of time that has occurred since the, whatever happened that spurred them to, introduce this bill, and all of the other rulemaking and legislation that has been passed in the interim that may have sort of alleviated any concerns or addressed the problems that were identified when these bills were first introduced.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I did have a question. In the past, when the CBA took an opposed position on this, were there other agencies that also took an opposed position, or was CBA the sole one making that?
There were
position?
others. I might be able to quickly pull that up, but I recall looking at previous bill analyses that there were other bodies besides the CBA that took an opposed position. But I don't have it, I'm working on it, I don't have it quite at my fingertips.
Okay, Ms. Hines?
Well, in the fiscal estimate on page 3, these boards at least took the step of identifying what the cost of complying would be.
Yes.
So I would guess that was one way in which other boards were at least considering what the impact of the bill would be. So you might check to see whether those costs were compiled in response or to support other boards' positions on addressing this bill, the impact of this bill.
That's a good point. And then my other question was, do we have an idea how often our CBA members meet in these 1 to 2 people meetings?
I don't know that an exhaustive list is available, or has been prepared rather. There's the example of the PROC meetings, that example that I cited, I believe that's an annual process. Whenever, as I mentioned before, this could impact our outreach activities. So if we have multiple board members attending and speaking at a college, then those could be examples where that could be swept in. So some of it's going to be situational and dependent upon the activities that the CBA or its committees engage in. If I may go back to the question about opposition from the other boards, I do have a list, and it looks like there was about 7 or 8 other DCA boards that were also opposed to the bill from 2015.
Thank you. Ms. Young?
Yeah, just a clarification. So the existing Keene Ackley Keene open meeting is what, 3 or more? requires they follow the
Constitute
act, so we're saying that they're trying to reduce it to 2 or more, and then we have to follow the
that-
act. Is
We
that
can't
correct?
have coffee anymore, so
That-
no more coffee for us.
So I believe, yes, for advisory bodies. So I think it's possible, and maybe legal counsel can help me, if there is a state body that on the natural has 3 members or 2 members, then a really small committee might be different if there was some other board that had 2 members, for example. But if the CBA creates an advisory committee or a CBA committee creates an advisory body to go out and do something, investigate and report back, then that's where the impact may be.
Okay, any more comments or questions? Any questions from the public? Okay, I think we can call for the vote. Ms. Reed?
Alicia Burhell,
Yes.
Nancy Corrigan,
Yes.
Carrie Ann Farrell Hines,
Yes.
Mary Jiang,
Yes.
Luz Molina Lopez.
Yes.
Corolla Nicholson,
Yes.
and Deirdre Robinson.
Yes.
Okay, with that, the motion passes. Let's see. Our item number 6 is public comments. Are there any comments from the public? Seeing none, just move on to the next one, down here. Okay, agenda item number 7 is agenda items for the next meeting. Do members wish to request that any items be placed on the next legislative committee meeting agenda? All right, seeing that there are none, this meeting is adjourned.